On the last Thursday of October 1904, a wooden crate arrived at Eleanor Vale's house before breakfast. It was not large, but it had been nailed shut as if it contained silver. Across the lid, in dark blue paint, someone had pressed a mark from a copper stencil. Riverside, E.V. The delivery boy said the superintendent of Mercy Hospital had ordered him to place it in Mrs. Vale's own hands. Thomas Vale heard this from the dining room and laughed. He was buttering toast, already dressed for the offices of Crescent Steel, with his high white collar touching the red place beneath his ear where the barber had nicked him. He told the boy that Mrs. Vale was occupied with household matters, and that women's washing could wait until after coffee. The boy did not laugh. He kept both hands beneath the crate and repeated the rest of the message. If Mrs. Vale refused what was inside, the fever ward would have no clean sheets by nightfall. Eleanor came down the stairs before Thomas could answer. She was 45 years old, though her husband had lately begun saying 46 when he spoke of her to other people. She wore a gray morning dress, severe at the throat and cuffs, and her dark hair had 2 silver threads above the left temple. They were finer than silk and impossible to hide unless she changed the way she parted her hair. She had never considered doing so. She signed the boy's paper, gave him a nickel for the hill, and carried the crate into the small room behind the pantry that Thomas called her sewing room. He had not entered it for nearly 6 years. Inside the crate lay a child's scorched nightdress, 3 brass laundry checks, and a broken copper stencil. Beneath them was a note from Dr. Samuel Green. There had been a boiler failure at the Riverside works during the night. One woman had been burned. The steam pipes were split. Mercy Hospital had taken the injured worker and 14 children from a tenement where scarlet fever had been found. By noon, the hospital would need 200 clean sheets, 100 gowns, bandages, towels, and boiled blankets. The note ended with a sentence that made Eleanor set both palms on her work table. Only you can decide whether we open the old washhouse. The old washhouse had been condemned 3 winters earlier. Its brick chimney leaned toward the river. Its drains froze in hard weather, and the floor had once buckled beneath a press. Yet it still held 2 copper boilers, a mangle, and enough drying frames to save a fever ward, if someone could bring coal, water, women, wagons, soap, and order to it before noon. Thomas called from the dining room that his coffee was cold. Eleanor folded Dr. Green's note. She put the scorched nightdress beside the stencil and looked at the blue letters on the copper. The plate had split through the V. For 11 years, that mark had traveled through Pittsburgh on linen carts before dawn. It appeared on hospital sheets, hotel napkins, surgeons' gowns, undertakers' cloths, and the white aprons of 3 dining rooms where Thomas himself had eaten. He had seen it perhaps 1,000 times. He had never once asked what the initials meant. Eleanor went to the telephone in the front hall. The Vales had been connected the previous spring, largely because Thomas liked to tell visitors that a man in his position could not rely on messenger boys. Eleanor disliked the instrument. It rang like an alarm and made private voices sound trapped inside metal. That morning she used it to wake the foreman of Nolan Coal, the driver at Schmidt's stable, and the chief engineer at Mercy Hospital. Then she telephoned Riverside. By 8 o'clock, 23 women were walking toward the old washhouse. Thomas stood in the hall with 1 glove on and 1 glove in his teeth. He asked whether she intended to leave the house looking like that. Eleanor glanced down at her plain gray dress. "Yes," she said. It was the only word she gave him. He removed the glove from his mouth and reminded her that they were expected that evening at the Founders' Supper for the new Mercy Surgical Wing. His mother had secured their places at the head table. Mr. Bellamy, the president of Crescent Steel, would attend. So would Miss Lillian Price, the young secretary who had organized the subscription committee, and whose name Thomas had mentioned at dinner every night for nearly a month. Eleanor said she remembered. Thomas watched her put on her old wool coat. Its cuffs had been mended twice. He offered the expression he used when a servant broke something inexpensive: regret softened by superiority. He said he hoped she would find time to look presentable. His mother had already observed that grey made Eleanor look tired. She buttoned the coat and left. Outside, the sky hung low over the Monongahela. Smoke from the mills pressed beneath the clouds until the whole valley seemed roofed in iron. The streetcars threw blue sparks against the morning. Men with dinner pails moved downhill toward the furnaces, and women lifted skirts above black gutters where ash floated in yesterday's rain. Eleanor walked quickly. She carried the broken stencil under her coat. 11 years earlier, when Eleanor first held that piece of copper, it had been bright enough to reflect a candle flame. Her brother William had cut it for her in the tin shop behind his hardware store. He had laughed at the careful letters she drew on brown paper. She wanted Riverside large enough to read from a wagon and EV small beneath it. William had suggested she use Thomas's full name. Everyone in business, he said, trusted a man's name more readily. Eleanor had considered it. In 1893, a woman could own property in Pennsylvania, sign certain contracts, and keep her wages. But law and life were not the same thing. A merchant might accept her signature and then ask when her husband would arrive. A banker might explain her own figures to Thomas while she sat beside him. A supplier might call her Little Lady while raising the price of soap by 2 cents a pound. Still, she had told William to cut EV. The initials had belonged to her before Thomas. Eleanor Voss had been the eldest daughter of a German dyer who taught all 5 of his children to count before they learned catechism. When she married into the Vale family, Thomas's mother had said that Voss sounded blunt and foreign, a name fit for a crate of nails. Eleanor had become Mrs. Thomas Vale in church notices, subscription lists, and invitations written by women who had never asked her Christian name. On copper, she kept both. The panic of 1893 had closed shops, emptied boarding houses, and sent men to stand in bread lines they crossed the street to avoid being seen in. Thomas had been a junior clerk at Crescent Steel then, proud of a salary that stopped arriving regularly. Their daughter Ruth was 9, and their son Peter only 4. Eleanor stretched flour with cornmeal and turned worn sheets from side to middle so the strong cloth would bear the weight. The first work came from a midwife named Mrs. Novak, who needed blood-stained linens boiled without questions. Then St. Agnes Home asked for 40 sheets a week. A small hotel near the depot sent tablecloths. Eleanor hired 2 widows whose husbands had been killed at the furnaces and rented the abandoned washhouse beside the river. She told Thomas it was temporary. At first, he was relieved. Her earnings paid the coal bill and kept Ruth in school. But when the worst of the panic passed, he expected the work to shrink into a memory. Instead, Eleanor learned that institutions did not merely need linen washed. They needed it counted, marked, collected, separated, boiled, dried, mended, returned, and recorded with a precision most household laundresses had never been permitted to develop. She designed a system of brass checks. Each customer had a shape, each bundle a number, each kind of cloth a notch. The women at Riverside could sort a wagon load in poor light without reading a word. Eleanor visited hospitals and watched nurses cover the infected mattresses with whatever cloth lay nearest. She read medical journals lent by Dr. Green and ordered a second boiler for fever linen alone. She fought hotel stewards who mixed kitchen rags with guest sheets and surgeons who wanted their gowns returned sooner than steam and sun allowed. By 1897, Riverside employed 31 women. By 1901, it owned 3 wagons. By 1904, it served Mercy Hospital, St. Agnes, 2 private clinics, 6 hotels, a funeral establishment, and the River Packet offices. Its contracts were in Eleanor's name. Its accounts were kept by a bookkeeper who had lost one hand in a press accident. Its workers received a hot meal at noon, a practice Thomas called sentimental, until Eleanor showed him that sickness and mistakes had both declined. Thomas knew none of these numbers. He knew that his wife helped at a laundry. Eleanor had once tried to correct him. It happened during Riverside's 4th year, when she came home late after a wagon axle broke on the south side. Thomas was reading the evening paper. Without looking up, he asked whether her washerwomen had survived their calamity. She told him that the axle had stranded 600 pieces of hospital linen, and that she had hired another wagon, renegotiated the delivery, and prevented an operating room from closing the next morning. Thomas lowered the paper just enough to smile. He said Eleanor always made domestic mishaps sound like military campaigns. She tried again 2 years later. Riverside had won the Mercy contract after 3 rounds of bidding. Eleanor placed the signed agreement beside his supper plate because she wanted, foolishly and simply, to hear that he was proud. Thomas glanced at the first page. He saw columns, seals, and a woman's signature. Then he moved the paper away from the gravy dish and said he was glad she had an occupation. His mother had been present that evening. Beatrice Vale sat at the far end of the table in mourning black, though Thomas's father had been dead for 12 years, and no one believed grief still chose her clothes. She had narrow blue eyes, a straight back, and the quiet authority of a woman who had spent half a lifetime making disapproval feel like weather. Beatrice asked Eleanor whether the work would now allow them to hire a better cook. That was the last time Eleanor brought a contract home. Silence did not arrive all at once. It formed in layers. First, she stopped explaining the difficulties. Then, she stopped reporting victories. Later, she stopped mentioning names. She left before Thomas woke on delivery mornings and returned in time to supervise supper. Her business coats hung behind aprons in the pantry room. Riverside papers remained at Riverside. When she had to attend an association meeting, she called it a ladies' committee, because Thomas understood committees as harmless places where women poured coffee and folded napkins. Ruth understood more. At 20, she was studying nursing at Mercy Hospital and had inherited Eleanor's habit of noticing who performed the work beneath an important man's speech. Peter, 15, knew every wagon horse by name and spent school holidays repairing check tags in the Riverside yard. Thomas believed the children visited because the women spoiled them with cakes. Perhaps Eleanor had permitted his blindness. That thought returned whenever anger began to rise. A truth hidden for convenience could become a lie without anyone speaking it. Yet she also remembered every moment when she had opened the door and Thomas had chosen not to enter. He did not lack opportunity. He lacked curiosity. There was a difference, and Eleanor had grown tired of forgiving it. The old Washhouse stood beyond the Riverside yard, near a row of workers' houses stained the same brown as the river. By the time Eleanor arrived, forewoman Margaret O'Shea had opened the shutters. Cold light fell across the idle boilers. Dust lay on the mangle rollers. A dead sparrow rested beneath the chimney flue. Margaret was 50, red-haired, broad-handed, and incapable of treating panic as anything but wasted time. She had already divided the women into crews. 6 would scrub the floor and drains, 4 would inspect the pipes, the rest would carry in coal, soap, baskets, and clean aprons. Eleanor showed her the broken stencil and Dr. Green's note. Margaret read it once. Then she asked who had been injured. The night engineer was at Mercy with burns along one arm. A boiler man had broken 2 ribs. Neither would die. The greater danger was not the accident, but the 14 children taken from the Willow Court tenement. Scarlet fever had passed through that court twice before. Mercy had beds, but no reserve linen, because its new wing had opened before the supply rooms were fully stocked. Margaret looked toward the old boilers and said the left one might hold if the cracked valve was replaced. The right one belonged to God now. Eleanor sent Peter, who had arrived breathless from school after hearing the news, to fetch Mr. Kopak from the machine shop. She sent another boy to ask St. Agnes for its spare drying frames. A telephone message came from Nolan Cole. The wagon had sunk to its hub on Crescent Street. Eleanor hired 3 carts from a brewery and paid the drivers in advance. By 10, the Washhouse smelled of wet brick, lye, hot metal, and women's wool drying near the stove. By 11, steam blurred the windows. At 11:30, the replacement valve screamed but held. The first wagon from Mercy arrived at noon. Linen from a fever ward did not resemble the white, orderly bundles seen on a household shelf. It arrived twisted, damp, stained, and dangerous. Fear traveled with it. 2 new girls stepped back when the canvas cover was lifted. Eleanor put on a boiled apron and wrapped her hair. She showed them how to keep infected cloth separate, how to use wooden tongs, how to count without shaking pieces open, and how to lower each load without splashing. She did not tell them there was nothing to fear. That would have been a lie. She told them fear was useful if it made their hands exact. At 1 o'clock, Thomas telephoned the main office. Peter answered. His father wanted to remind Eleanor about the supper and to ask whether his evening shirt had been pressed. Peter looked through the glass partition toward the old washhouse. His mother stood in steam beside Margaret. Both women bent over the delivery schedule. Behind them, 40 arms moved sheets from boiler to rinse trough, from wringer to drying frame. A Mercy wagon waited at the gate. Another rattled down the hill. Peter told his father that Mrs. Vale was occupied. Thomas asked him not to be insolent. Peter set down the receiver more gently than he wished to. At 2, Ruth arrived from Mercy with a message. The first child had begun to struggle for breath. 2 nurses were ill, and the matron had opened a ward in the unfinished wing. Dr. Green said the first clean delivery must come by 5. Eleanor's schedule promised 6. She crossed out the time. Every hand in the washhouse moved faster. Women ate bread and cheese standing up. Margaret discovered that the drying room's upper vent would not open and climbed a ladder herself. Peter ran between buildings with brass checks strung on wire. Ruth returned to Mercy carrying the first bundles of bandages in a streetcar, holding them above the dirty floor as if they were infants. At 4:40, the Riverside wagon rolled out with 70 sheets, 40 gowns, 60 towels, and all the blankets the old frames could dry. Eleanor watched it turn toward the bridge. Only then did she remember the supper. Her gray dress was spotted with steam and lye. A strand of hair had come loose. The clock in the office showed 10 minutes before 5. The founders' supper began at 7 in the Hotel Shenley across the city. Margaret told her to remain where she was. Mercy would need the next load at 8. The women needed her more than rich people needed another white shoulder at their table. Eleanor knew that. She also knew Beatrice Vale would make her absence into a story, and Thomas would spend years repeating that story as proof his wife did not understand the obligations of his position. She had lived long enough to know that some rooms could damage a woman, whether she entered them or stayed away. She washed in the office basin. Margaret found a clean shirtwaist in the emergency cupboard, too large in the shoulder and too tight at the wrist. Eleanor's dark skirt could pass after brushing. Ruth sent a cab from Mercy, along with a narrow box holding a pair of lace cuffs borrowed from the matron. Before Eleanor left, Peter handed her the broken copper stencil. He had bound the split with fine wire. It would not survive another coat of paint, but the initials met again. Eleanor put it in her bag. The Hotel Shenley glowed above the dark streets like a ship made of windows. Carriages crowded the entrance. Men in black coats stepped down beneath umbrellas, while women lifted silk hems away from the wet pavement. Through the doors came heat, flowers, cigar smoke, and the music of a small orchestra hidden behind palms. Eleanor arrived at 7:23. Thomas was waiting near the cloakroom. He did not ask why she was late. His eyes went first to the borrowed cuffs, then to the plain skirt, then to the faint red mark where lye had touched her wrist. His disappointment was swift and intimate. He told her that everyone else had managed to dress for the occasion. Eleanor gave her coat to the attendant. She said there had been an accident at Riverside and a fever emergency at Mercy. Thomas heard only the familiar word. He said the hotel maintained its own laundry, and surely she might have trusted someone else with the matter for one evening. Behind him, Beatrice Vale approached in a black silk gown with jet beads at the collar. At 68, she remained handsome in the severe manner of courthouse statues. Her white hair was arranged perfectly. A small fan hung from her wrist by a ribbon. She looked at Eleanor's cuffs. Her gaze paused on the hand beneath them, reddened from heat. For a moment, something moved in her face. Not kindness, exactly, but recognition. Then she said Mr. Bellamy had already noticed the empty chair. Thomas offered his arm to his mother. Eleanor walked beside them into the ballroom. The founders' supper had been arranged to celebrate Mercy Hospital's new surgical wing, but the room resembled a tribute to the men whose names appeared on the subscription list. Bankers, mill owners, physicians, lawyers and their wives sat beneath electric chandeliers that made the silverware burn. A printed program lay at every place. Across the top, in elaborate letters, were the names of the 3 largest donors. Eleanor knew that 2 had reduced their promised gifts before payment. The 3rd had sent his check only after the hospital agreed to carve his father's name above the entrance. No program named the nurses who had furnished a ward from their own wages. None mentioned Riverside's 6 months of unpaid service during the smallpox scare of 1899. Eleanor did not expect it. Work that touched blood, sickness, kitchens, or washing was useful precisely as long as respectable people did not have to see it. At the head table, Thomas placed his mother beside Mr. Bellamy and Eleanor beside a junior surgeon she had met twice at Mercy. Across from them sat Lillian Price. Lillian was 28, not 25, as Thomas had told Ruth. Her hair was the color of chestnuts and arranged beneath a pearl comb. She wore a cream dress without unnecessary trimming and kept a pencil inside her program. Whenever a speaker gave a figure, she noted it in the margin. Eleanor liked her at once and resented the liking. For a month, Thomas had praised Lillian's quick memory, her good judgment, the calm way she handled difficult men on the subscription committee. He described these qualities as if he had discovered them in nature. When Eleanor pointed out that Crescent Steel had employed female clerks for years, he said most women lacked the temperament for serious responsibility. He did not notice the contradiction. Before the soup was served, Lillian leaned across the table and asked Eleanor whether she had come from Mercy. She had heard there was trouble with the fever ward. Eleanor began to answer, but Thomas placed a hand on the back of her chair. He explained that his wife concerned herself with linens and charitable domestic arrangements. Eleanor had always needed to be busy. He spoke warmly, almost proudly, in the tone a man might use about a wife who grew prize roses. Then he told Lillian that Eleanor could perhaps introduce her to some women at Riverside if she truly remained determined to leave clerical work. He laughed and added that the place must require someone who understood more than soap. Mr. Bellamy heard the last sentence. He asked whether Thomas referred to the Riverside wash. Thomas said he did. His wife was queen of the washboards. The men nearest them smiled. Their wives looked at Eleanor, then at her hands. One woman lowered her eyes with the speed of practiced mercy. Eleanor felt the broken stencil inside her bag press against her knee. Humiliation was not always hot. At 20, she had believed shame must set the face on fire and fill the ears with pounding. At 45, she knew it could be cold and exact. It could sharpen every detail. The bubble traveling through the water glass, the frayed edge of the junior surgeon's cuff, the tiny ink mark on Lillian's finger, the scent of oysters cooling in cream. Thomas had made a joke because he wanted Mr. Bellamy to find him easy. He had used her life as the soft part of himself he could cut away without bleeding. Lillian did not smile. She asked Thomas how many employees the Wash employed. He waved one hand and said, 12, perhaps. Women came and went. Eleanor said there were 48. The table quieted just enough for the number to fall between the plates. Thomas glanced at her. For the first time that evening, uncertainty entered his face. He recovered quickly and said his wife counted everyone, including delivery boys and girls who stayed only through the summer. Eleanor told him that the figure did not include seasonal workers. With them, the number was 61. Mr. Bellamy's smile vanished. Crescent Steel's relief committee had struggled for 3 weeks to organize half that many volunteers. He asked who supervised such a concern. Before Eleanor could answer, the orchestra stopped, and the master of ceremonies called the room to order. Thomas turned toward the platform with visible relief. The speeches began. The hospital president described progress. A banker described duty. Mr. Bellamy described industry's debt to the city while failing to mention the men injured in his furnaces. Beatrice sat perfectly still, her jet beads shining like drops of oil. Lillian kept her pencil ready but wrote less as the speeches grew longer. At 8:10, a hotel page entered and spoke to the junior surgeon beside Eleanor. He read the card, looked at her, and passed it over. Mercy requires Mrs. Eleanor Vale at once. The words were not discreet. 3 people read them while the card crossed the table. Eleanor rose. Thomas whispered that she could not leave in the middle of Mr. Bellamy's address. She told him the fever ward could not wait until the coffee. Beatrice's fan stopped moving. Lillian stood as well. She said the subscription committee's carriage was outside and offered to take Eleanor to Mercy. Thomas objected that Miss Price had duties at the supper. Lillian closed her program over the pencil. She said the hospital was the duty. They left together beneath the eyes of the head table. In the cloakroom, Lillian helped Eleanor into her old coat. She did not ask about Thomas's joke or offer the soft lie that he had meant no harm. Instead, she asked what Mercy needed and whether she could carry anything. Eleanor handed her the bag with the broken stencil. It was a small act, but the weight of it changed something. The fever ward occupied a corridor that still smelled of plaster. Beds stood closer than regulations allowed. Children lay beneath gray blankets with scarlet faces and dull eyes. Kerosene lamps supplemented the unfinished electric fixtures, throwing 2 kinds of light across the walls. Ruth met them at the entrance. Her white apron was spotted with carbolic solution. She told Eleanor that 3 more children had arrived, and the first linen delivery had been used before 7. The old Washhouse wagon had broken a wheel near the bridge. The second load was somewhere on the south side. Eleanor went to the telephone room. She called Schmidt's stable, the police station nearest the bridge, and the Riverside office. No one answered at Riverside, because everyone who could stand was working in steam. Lillian listened, then asked for the address of the broken wagon. She knew a livery owner whose daughter had been treated at Mercy the previous winter. She telephoned him herself, used the hospital committee's name, and obtained 2 wagons without charge. By 9, the linen arrived. Eleanor and Lillian carried sheets upstairs with nurses and orderlies. Fine cream silk was not made for such work. The hem of Lillian's dress darkened on the wet steps, One sleeve caught on a crate and tore near the elbow. She looked at it once and continued. At 10, Dr. Green found Eleanor in the supply room counting blankets. He was a tired, square man whose beard had begun turning white during the smallpox winter and never stopped. In public, he called her Mrs. Vale. In a crisis, he called her Eleanor, because there was no time to protect men from the knowledge that they trusted a woman. He said the old Washhouse had saved the ward. Lillian stood behind him holding a stack of gowns. Her eyes moved from the doctor to Eleanor. Dr. Green continued. Mercy's board had delayed the reserve contract again. If Riverside could guarantee emergency service through winter, he would force a vote at Monday's meeting. He needed Eleanor's price and her conditions by morning. Eleanor said Riverside would guarantee it if Mercy paid the women an infection premium and funded a new steam line. She would not send workers into fever linen for ordinary wages. Dr. Green agreed before she finished. Lillian understood then. Not all of it, but enough. She asked Eleanor whether Riverside belonged to her. Yes, Eleanor said. There was no audience for the word, no orchestra stopped, no man's face changed. A feverish child cried in the next room, and a nurse hurried past with a basin. Yet saying it there felt more honest than any announcement from a platform. Lillian looked down at the gowns in her arms. She said Thomas had told her Riverside was a charitable circle his wife assisted. Eleanor replied that Thomas said many things when facts would require attention. The bitterness in her own voice surprised her. She expected Lillian to retreat. Instead, the younger woman said nothing for several seconds. Then she asked where the gowns belonged. Eleanor showed her. Near midnight, the first sick child began to improve. 2 others worsened. Dr. Green would not predict the morning. Eleanor stayed until the 3rd linen delivery was stacked, counted, and marked. Lillian remained too. When they finally left Mercy, the rain had stopped. The city seemed washed only from a distance. Along the curbs, black water carried straw, cinders, and horse manure toward the drains. They shared a cab. Lillian's torn sleeve was covered by Eleanor's coat. She held the broken stencil on her lap. She said she had wanted to speak with Eleanor even before the supper. She did not want charity or an introduction to washerwomen. She wanted work that mattered after the subscription committee ended. Crescent Steel paid her to copy Thomas's letters and arrange his appointments, but she had written half the relief proposals he presented under his own name. Eleanor turned from the window. Lillian said this without anger. That made it worse. Thomas had promised to speak to someone on her behalf. He implied his wife knew women connected with hospitals and hotels. Lillian assumed Eleanor was a society volunteer with useful acquaintances. She had not known Thomas meant to offer another woman's authority as if it were a small favor kept in his coat pocket. The cab passed a furnace where night became orange. Men moved against the fire like paper figures. Eleanor asked why Lillian had trusted him. Lillian considered the question. She said Thomas praised her mind. In an office where most men praised only her penmanship, it had felt like respect. Eleanor looked at the young woman's ink-stained finger. She remembered being 28 and mistaking usefulness for love, attention for recognition, permission for partnership. She did not warn Lillian away from Thomas. Warnings given by wives were too easily mistaken for jealousy, especially by women who had been taught to measure their worth through a man's special notice. Instead, she asked Lillian to visit Riverside on Monday at 8 in the morning. Not as Thomas's recommendation, not as a favor. Riverside needed an assistant superintendent who could write contracts, manage schedules, and stand upright when men laughed. Lillian's hands tightened around the stencil. She asked whether Eleanor was offering her the position. Eleanor said she was offering an interview. For the first time that night, Lillian smiled. When the cab reached the Vale house, only one lamp burned downstairs. Thomas had returned from the supper and gone to bed. On the hall table, beneath the calling card tray, he had left a note saying the evening had become awkward after Eleanor's departure, and that they would discuss it when she was reasonable. Beside the note lay her lace cuffs, still fastened to the shirtwaist she had borrowed. Beatrice had sent them back by messenger. Pinned inside the left cuff was a narrow strip of paper in Beatrice's hand. "Come to me tomorrow. Bring the copper mark." Eleanor read the sentence twice. She had not shown Beatrice the stencil. Beatrice Vale lived in a stone house on a hill above Allegheny City, where smoke reached the windows only on certain winds. The house had been built by Thomas's grandfather and improved by every generation without becoming comfortable. Its carpets muffled footsteps. Its chairs discouraged rest. Portraits of dead Vales watched the rooms with the confidence of people who had never doubted their names would remain on the walls. Eleanor arrived Saturday afternoon. Beatrice received her in the back parlor, a room rarely opened to visitors. No fire had been lit, though the day was cold. On a table beside the window stood a wooden box bound in cracked green leather. Beatrice did not ask about the fever children. She asked for the copper mark. Eleanor removed the stencil from her bag. The older woman held it near the window. Her thumb passed over the wired split and stopped at the initials. She appeared less surprised than tired. Then she opened the green box. Inside were dozens of pieces of paper wrapped in faded ribbon. Receipts from 1893, rent notices, supplier bills, handwritten wage lists, and the first contract between Eleanor Vale and St. Agnes Home. Beneath them lay a second copper stencil. It was smaller than Eleanor's. The letters were worn almost smooth. B.H. Beatrice said the initials had once stood for Beatrice Hale. Before she became a Vale, before her husband owned a controlling share in 3 rolling mills, she had operated a sewing room with her elder sister in Wheeling. They made work shirts for rivermen. During the war years, they had sewn hospital shifts and bandages. At 19, Beatrice knew the price of muslin in 4 counties and could cut 6 shirts from cloth that yielded 5 in another woman's hands. She married Henry Vale in 1866. Within a month, the sewing room became an embarrassment. Henry told customers his wife had been helping her sister for amusement. He purchased the remaining cloth, dismissed the women, and placed the money in his own account. Beatrice's stencil disappeared. Eleanor looked at the worn copper in her hand. She asked how it came back. Beatrice said her sister had kept it. It was returned after the sister's death, along with the papers Henry had never known existed. The older woman sat down. Without the rigid line of her back, she seemed suddenly smaller. She told Eleanor that 11 years earlier, during the panic, Thomas had visited her and asked for money. He said Eleanor had begun taking in hospital washing, and the family required help until she abandoned the scheme. Beatrice refused to give him cash. The next morning, she went to William Voss's hardware store and paid for the copper boilers Eleanor had ordered. She did it through a solicitor and required that title remain in Eleanor's name. Later, she guaranteed the lease on the Riverside property. In 1897, when Thomas pressed Eleanor to mortgage the Washhouse so he could purchase shares in a failed Coke concern, Beatrice bought the note from the bank and locked it in the green box. Eleanor could not speak. She remembered those years as a sequence of narrow escapes. The boiler supplier who unexpectedly extended credit. The landlord who withdrew his threat. The banker who stopped sending notices after Thomas brought home papers and complained that the matter had become tangled. She had called it luck. Beatrice had called it nothing. The older woman said she had watched Eleanor build what she herself had surrendered. At first, she believed severity would protect it. Praise, in Beatrice's experience, alerted men to a thing worth taking. Silence kept them careless. She had treated Riverside as insignificant whenever Thomas spoke of it, and Thomas learned the lesson too well. Eleanor thought of the signed mercy contract, moved away from the gravy dish. She remembered Beatrice asking whether the money would hire a better cook. She said cruelty was a poor disguise for protection. Beatrice accepted the words without defense. For nearly 40 years, she had survived by making herself resemble the men who controlled her. She knew how to hide a note, secure a title, frighten a banker, and deny affection before it could be used against her. She did not know how to tell another woman she was proud. The confession did not erase anything. It did not warm the back parlor or soften the years. Eleanor still felt every slight. But beneath the old injury, another truth opened. She had not built entirely alone. There had been a hand under the first boiler, invisible because its owner believed invisibility was the only safe form of love. Beatrice pushed the green box toward her. The box contained the original note on Riverside's property. It had been satisfied 5 years earlier, but Beatrice had never transferred the release. If she died, Thomas might find the papers and claim confusion. She wanted Eleanor to take them now. Eleanor asked, "Why now?" Beatrice looked toward the black window. At the supper, when Thomas called Eleanor Queen of the Washboards, Beatrice heard Henry Vale speaking through his son. The voice was lighter, the words more modern, but the theft was the same. A man was reducing a woman's work until he could stand taller beside it. She had spent 11 years believing she protected Eleanor by remaining silent. That night, she understood she had also protected Thomas from the shame of his own ignorance. Beatrice placed her BH stencil beside Eleanor's broken one. "Enough," she said. It was the first word of alliance between them. Eleanor carried the green box home beneath her coat. Thomas was in the library with the Sunday papers spread around him, although it was Saturday. He collected unread papers the way some men collected obligations, always intending to master them later. A cigar burned in the tray beside his chair. He asked whether his mother had complained about the supper. Eleanor said Beatrice had discussed family property. Thomas lowered the paper. Property was a word that brought his full attention where fever, work, and humiliation could not. He asked which property. Eleanor placed the green box on the floor beside her chair, beyond his reach. She told him it concerned Riverside. His interest faded. He said his mother had always involved herself in matters beneath her dignity when she believed someone might be cheated by a tradesman. Eleanor studied the page raised between them. Thomas was 47, still broad in the shoulders, still handsome when expectation relaxed his mouth. She had loved that face when it belonged to a young clerk who walked her home along the river and listened while she described her father's dye vats. Perhaps he had listened then. Perhaps she had filled his silence with understanding because she wanted it so badly. She told him Riverside employed 61 people in busy months. He said she had made that point at supper. It owned 2 buildings and leased a third. It held 9 institutional contracts. Its payroll in September exceeded what Thomas earned in 3 months. The paper did not move. Eleanor said the business belonged to her. Thomas folded one corner of the page, then smoothed it. He told her no one denied that it was her project. "Not project," she said. "Business." He sighed. The sound carried 20 years of masculine patience. He said he had endured a difficult evening. Mr. Bellamy had been offended by her departure, and his mother had plainly filled Eleanor's head with unnecessary defiance. If she wanted praise for keeping a washhouse solvent, he was willing to give it. He was proud of her. There. Surely they need not turn every domestic disagreement into a contest. Eleanor felt something inside her become very still. She had believed facts might serve as a bridge. Thomas used them instead as stones to build the wall higher. She took the green box upstairs. That night they slept in the same bed, with the distance of 2 houses between them. On Sunday morning, Thomas attended church alone. Eleanor went to Mercy. 2 of the fever children had improved. One, a 6-year-old girl named Anna Kowalski, had died just before dawn. Her mother sat beside the small covered body, one rough hand resting on the Riverside sheet. There are moments when an enterprise loses every number that can be written beside it. The sheet had cost 17 cents to purchase, 3 cents to boil, 1 cent to mend, and less than that to carry across the river. None of those figures measured what it meant to the mother that the cloth was clean when she folded it back from her child's face. Eleanor stood with her until the priest came. Afterward, Dr. Green brought the emergency contract to the matron's office. He had written Eleanor's conditions into it. Infection wages would be paid. Mercy would fund new steam pipes and reserve storage. Riverside would maintain a trained emergency crew through winter. At the bottom, beneath the hospital seal, a blank line waited for Eleanor Vale, proprietor. She signed both names. The pen did not tremble. Lillian Price arrived at Riverside at 7:45 Monday morning. She wore a navy skirt, a plain jacket, and boots sensible enough for the yard. Her cream supper dress had vanished as completely as the pearl comb. She carried a portfolio tied with black tape. Eleanor had expected punctuality. She had not expected Lillian to resign from Crescent Steel before the interview. Lillian said Thomas had summoned her shortly after arriving at the office. Mr. Bellamy disliked disruptions, and leaving the supper had been judged a disruption. Thomas offered to prevent formal reprimand if she apologized and agreed to confine her hospital work to assigned duties. She asked whether he would also apologize to his wife. Thomas replied that his marriage was not an office matter. Lillian said her resignation was. Eleanor listened without satisfaction. Thomas's arrogance had cost him an able employee, but Lillian now stood without wages and carried the fragile pride of someone who could not afford many principles. The interview lasted 2 hours. Eleanor reviewed the subscription schedules Lillian had designed. They were clean, logical, and far better than the committee's published report. Lillian could type, take shorthand, calculate percentages, and write letters in voices suited to bankers, doctors, or aldermen. She knew nothing about boiling temperatures, cloth weights, infection separation, route planning, or the quiet rivalries among forewomen. Eleanor offered her 6 weeks as probationary assistant at $18 a week, $2 less than Crescent Steel had paid. Lillian asked whether the wage would increase if she learned. Eleanor said it would increase when she became useful. Lillian accepted. For the first week, Eleanor placed her in every department she had once assumed could be understood from a desk. Lillian counted torn sheets beside the menders, loaded a wagon in rain, marked uniforms with the copper stencil, and spent half a day in the steam room until her face shone and her collar wilted. Margaret watched her with the suspicion reserved for well-dressed women who used long words. On Thursday, Lillian caught a hotel steward attempting to charge Riverside for 8 tablecloths never delivered. She produced the brass checks, the driver's signature, and the steward's own count from the previous month. He withdrew the claim. Margaret's suspicion weakened. On Friday, a new girl mixed maternity linen with kitchen cloths. Lillian did not scold her before the others. She separated the load, explained the danger, and remained after closing to help repeat the work. Margaret brought her tea. By the 3rd week, Lillian had redrawn the route schedules. 2 wagons stopped crossing the same bridge within an hour of each other. Overtime declined. The drivers complained for 3 days, and then discovered they reached home earlier. Eleanor raised her wage. Thomas did not know where Lillian had gone. He mentioned her twice at supper during the first week. He said young women were impulsive, and that Lillian would regret abandoning a respectable office. During the second week, he asked Eleanor whether the hospital committee had heard from her. Eleanor said yes. Thomas waited. Eleanor did not continue. By the third week, he stopped speaking Lillian's name. The silence should have given Eleanor peace. Instead, she noticed the care with which Thomas now discussed his office. He named men, but not women. He locked his dispatch case at night. He began arriving home later and attributed it to a new rail order from Baltimore, though Crescent Steel's rail division was not his department. Eleanor did not imagine an affair. That would have given shape to the injury and perhaps made it easier to confront. What existed between Thomas and Lillian had been subtler. The pleasure of being admired, the vanity of mentoring a woman whose intelligence made his attention look generous, the private theater in which he cast himself as the discoverer of her abilities. He had wanted her gratitude more than her future. Eleanor wondered how often he had wanted the same from his wife. Beatrice first visited Riverside on a cold morning in November. She arrived in her carriage wearing sealskin and carrying a cane she did not need. Every worker in the yard knew at once that an important lady had come to inspect something she expected to dislike. Eleanor met her at the gate. Beatrice said she wished to see the boilers. The request surprised Eleanor more than an apology would have. They walked through the receiving room, where bundles were weighed and marked. Beatrice watched brass checks fall into wooden trays. In the sorting room, she stopped beside women separating hotel linen from hospital cloth. In the mending room, 30 needles moved beneath a wall of windows clouded by steam. Some workers stood when she passed. Beatrice told them to sit. At the new Washhouse, Eleanor showed her the fever boiler and the safety valves added after the accident. Beatrice asked practical questions. How much coal per load? How often were the belts inspected? Who controlled the boiler when Margaret was absent? What happened to a woman's wages if she became ill from infected linen? Her knowledge was old, but not dead. Margaret heard the questions and looked at her differently. In the stencil room, Peter had mounted the broken copper plate above his workbench. Beneath it lay the new plate William had cut that morning. The letters were sharper, the copper thicker. Beatrice opened her handbag. She removed the BH stencil and set it beside Eleanor's. Peter asked whose it was. Beatrice told him. He touched the worn letters with one finger. No one in the family had told him his grandmother once made anything with her hands. Beatrice replied that families often preserved the least useful facts. Peter offered to mount her stencil too. She hesitated, then she said yes. The 2 copper plates remained above the workbench, one bright and one worn. Women passing beneath them began to ask questions. Beatrice's sewing room, closed nearly 40 years, became a story again. Not the romantic story of a young lady amusing herself with charity, but the true one. 2 sisters, 12 sewing machines, government orders, night work, wages, and a husband who ended it because success in his wife made him feel diminished. Beatrice returned the following Thursday, then the Thursday after that. She never announced a regular visit. She simply appeared at 10, removed her gloves, and sat in the mending room. At first, she corrected stitches. Later, she listened. The widows, immigrants, abandoned wives, and unmarried daughters of Riverside did not treat her as a matriarch. They treated her as an old seamstress with excellent eyes and difficult manners. It was the first honest place Beatrice had occupied in years. Thomas learned of the visits from his coachman. At supper, He asked Eleanor whether she had encouraged his mother to spend time among laundresses. Eleanor said Beatrice required no encouragement. He complained of damp air, infection, and unsuitable company. His mother's health was not strong. Beatrice's health had been strong enough to dominate 3 households, 2 funerals, and every Christmas dinner since 1880. Eleanor said so. Thomas put down his fork. He wanted to know why every conversation now ended with Eleanor challenging him. She replied that the conversations had always ended that way. The difference was that she had begun answering aloud. Ruth looked down at her plate. Peter did not. Thomas told the children to leave the room. Eleanor said they could stay. They had lived inside the marriage all their lives. Sending them away would not make them ignorant of it. Thomas's face darkened. He spoke more quietly, which was how his anger announced itself. He said she had changed since the hospital supper. Work had filled her with exaggerated notions. His mother was encouraging them, perhaps because old age made women delight in discord. He had tolerated Riverside because it kept Eleanor content, but he would not allow it to destroy peace in his home. Eleanor looked around the dining room. The curtains had been chosen by Beatrice. Thomas's place was set with the knife he preferred. The roast had been ordered, the fire laid, the lamp trimmed, the children trained to lower their voices when he read. Peace, as Thomas understood it, was an arrangement maintained by other people. She asked what he meant by allow. He had no answer ready. That frightened him. He rose from the table and went to his library. A moment later, the door closed. Peter whispered that his father did not know Riverside could purchase their house 3 times over. Ruth told him not to be cruel. Eleanor said neither money nor cruelty was the point. A poor woman's work deserved recognition no less than a rich woman's. If Thomas learned only because Riverside was valuable, he would have learned the wrong thing. Still, Peter's words followed her upstairs. The house had been purchased in Thomas's name. Eleanor paid nearly half the mortgage during the panic, and every payment during the year Thomas invested in the Coke concern. She had never asked that the deed be changed. At the time, demanding her share would have sounded like preparing to leave. Now she understood that a woman did not have to plan departure in order to name what she had built. The next morning, she visited Beatrice's solicitor. The solicitor, Mr. Abram Seelig, occupied 2 rooms above a pharmacy. He had represented Beatrice for 20 years because, as she once said, he was the only lawyer in Pittsburgh who did not treat a woman's signature as an interruption. He examined Eleanor's papers. The Riverside property was secure. The house was more complicated. She could document payments, but Thomas held the deed and had pledged a portion of his interest against a private note. Eleanor had not known of the note. Mr. Seelig showed her the recorded instrument. Thomas had borrowed $4,000 in August from a bank director connected to Crescent Steel. The stated purpose was investment. The house stood as collateral. Eleanor read the page twice. In August, Thomas had told her the roof repair must wait because the household expenses were excessive. She asked whether a husband could pledge the family home without informing his wife. Mr. Seelig's answer was careful. The law allowed more than marriage could survive. The investment named in the private papers was the Allegheny Improvement Syndicate, a group purchasing land near a proposed steel expansion. Thomas expected the value to rise when Crescent announced a new rolling mill. If he had learned the location through his office before public notice, the profit would rest on information that did not belong to him. Eleanor felt no surprise. That troubled her more than shock would have. Thomas had always wanted the authority of wealth without enduring the slow labor that created it. He admired men who made fortunes in a season and called caution a woman's virtue. Riverside grew by pennies saved from soap, wagon routes shortened by half a mile, cloth repaired before it tore, workers trained before crisis. Thomas saw only washing, because he did not recognize accumulation unless it arrived with a brass plate on an office door. Mr. Seelig asked what she wished to do. Eleanor did not know. She could repay the note and protect the house, but doing so secretly would repeat the pattern that had shaped her marriage. Thomas risked, Eleanor repaired, and no one named either act. She could confront him, but he might deny, sell, borrow again, or accuse her of humiliating him. She could demand legal separation, though the word alone might end Ruth's hospital position and stain Peter at school. A wife with property had choices. A wife with children and a name in a city still paid for each one. She asked Mr. Seelig to make copies and take no action yet. As she left, the pharmacy clock struck noon. Across the street, a newsboy shouted about a labor dispute at Crescent Steel. Men at the Homestead Works had refused a new shift schedule. The company denied any danger of stoppage. Eleanor bought a paper. On the second page, beneath the report, a short notice announced that Crescent Steel would soon disclose plans for an additional rolling mill east of the city. No site was named. Thomas's land lay east of the city. Eleanor folded the paper and put it beside the private note in her bag. For the first time, the danger in her marriage extended beyond insult. Thomas had placed the roof over their children into a wager built on another man's secret. That evening she waited until Ruth and Peter went upstairs. She laid the note on Thomas's desk. He looked at the bank seal, then at her. His first response was not shame, but offense. He asked who had permitted her to investigate his affairs. Eleanor said the house was her affair. Thomas told her the investment was sound. Within 6 months, the land would double. Men at Crescent had formed the syndicate together, and Mr. Bellamy himself expected expansion. She asked whether Mr. Bellamy knew Thomas had used information from the office. Thomas stood so quickly, his chair struck the wall. He accused her of twisting ordinary business into dishonor because she had spent too many hours among suspicious women. He had borrowed against his own property. He would repay it. She understood nothing about industrial opportunity. Eleanor opened her bag and set Riverside's October balance sheet beside the note. She did not use it as proof of superiority. She used it as evidence that she understood risk. Thomas looked at the first line: revenue, payroll, reserves, equipment. He saw numbers larger than he expected and moved closer to the lamp. For several minutes, he read without speaking. Eleanor watched knowledge arrive in pieces. First came disbelief, then calculation, then the instinct to search for a man behind the figures. He asked whether William controlled the accounts. She said no. Dr. Green, then? A silent partner? No. Beatrice? No. Riverside belonged to Eleanor. William had cut a stencil. Dr. Green had signed contracts. Beatrice had guaranteed the first equipment and kept the property safe. None owned a share. Thomas sat down. The balance sheet should have opened his eyes. Instead, it opened a door into need. He said that if Riverside held such reserves, Eleanor could discharge the banknote before Christmas. They would then keep the house and the land profit. She stared at him. He had crossed from ignorance to entitlement without pausing at recognition. Eleanor gathered the balance sheet, but left the banknote on his desk. She said Riverside would not rescue his speculation. Thomas asked whether she intended to let the family lose its home to punish him. Eleanor replied that he had risked the home to reward himself. The argument rose after that, not into shouting, but into 20 years of hidden accounts. Thomas listed every social burden he had carried, every introduction he had provided, every evening he had endured alone while she worked. Eleanor named mortgage payments, school fees, coal bills, and the invisible labor that made his position appear larger than his salary. He said a wife should not keep a fortune secret. She said a husband should not make his wife's life too small to be believed. Near midnight, Thomas left the library. He slept in the guest room. In the morning, he went to work without coffee. For 10 days, Thomas and Eleanor spoke only when a sentence could not be avoided. He asked whether supper would be at 7. She said yes. She asked whether he required the carriage on Thursday. He said no. At night, the guest room door closed with the careful softness of accusation. The children moved through the house as people move near thin ice. Peter remained later at Riverside. Ruth took extra duty at Mercy. Even the maid began polishing silver in the kitchen rather than the dining room. Outside the house, the city entered winter. Ice formed along the riverbanks. Smoke settled early in the streets. At Riverside, wet sheets froze stiff between the washhouse and drying room if a cart paused too long. The emergency contract required new shelves, a second night crew, and drills for infection deliveries. Eleanor had no time to wait for Thomas to become the man she had once believed him to be. Lillian learned faster than anyone expected. She developed a card system for reserve linen. Each hospital assigned a color, and each ward a stamped corner. She persuaded Mercy to standardize sheet sizes, saving hours of sorting. When 2 hotel managers refused the new winter rates, she prepared the true cost of cold and carriage delays in terms simple enough to survive male impatience. The managers signed. Yet ability did not protect a woman from story. On the first Sunday in December, Eleanor entered the vestibule of First Presbyterian and heard Lillian's name stop in 3 separate conversations. The rumor had begun at Crescent Steel. A young secretary had left suddenly after accompanying a married man's wife from a public supper. She had then taken employment with that wife. According to one version, Lillian had pursued Thomas and Eleanor hired her to keep watch. According to another, Thomas had dismissed Lillian after an indiscretion and Eleanor took pity on her. A third made Beatrice the architect of a private settlement designed to protect the Vale name. No version allowed 2 women to leave a supper because children were sick. Eleanor removed her gloves finger by finger. Near the church doors, Mrs. Walter Peabody greeted her with the tender solemnity of someone delighted by another family's pain. She said everyone admired Eleanor's Christian generosity. It took an uncommon spirit to employ a girl under such circumstances. Eleanor asked which circumstances. Mrs. Peabody lowered her voice and said it would be kinder not to name them. Beatrice appeared beside Eleanor. She wore her oldest mourning bonnet and carried the cane. The congregation gave her space from habit. Beatrice said that when a woman claimed kindness as her reason for spreading filth, she should at least possess the courage to pronounce the filth clearly. Mrs. Peabody turned crimson. Beatrice continued in an even voice. Miss Price had left the Founders' Supper to assist Mercy Hospital during a scarlet fever emergency. She was now employed by Mrs. Vale's company because she had proved capable. Any person who repeated another account would be required to repeat it in Beatrice's parlor before witnesses. People had begun listening. Mrs. Peabody murmured that she had meant no offense. Beatrice said offense was often the result of people meaning pleasure. Then she offered Eleanor her arm and walked into church. The rumor did not disappear, but it lost the safety of whispers. That mattered. After the service, Ruth found them beneath the stone arcade. She had been crying and tried to conceal it by blaming the wind. Her trouble was not Lillian directly. It was the family of Daniel Mercer, a young physician at Mercy who had been calling on her since summer. Daniel's mother had telephoned that morning. Until the uncertainty surrounding the Vale household settled, she thought it wise for the young people to see less of one another. Ruth said she did not care. Her face said she did. Eleanor felt a sharp, useless wish to shield her daughter from every cost of the truth. For years, that wish had helped keep the marriage quiet. A respectable household protected Ruth's prospects. A father rising at Crescent offered Peter a future. Eleanor had swallowed small humiliations because children should not have to purchase a mother's dignity. Now she saw the other side. Children also paid for a mother's silence. Ruth had learned to call hurt unimportant. Peter had learned that a man could ignore women's work and remain master of the table. Eleanor told Ruth she was sorry. Ruth shook her head. She said Daniel had defended Lillian and the hospital work. It was his mother who objected. Beatrice struck the pavement once with her cane. She said a man old enough to treat fever was old enough to decide whom he called upon. Ruth almost smiled. That afternoon, Daniel Mercer arrived at the Vale house. He came on foot through snow and brought no flowers. He asked Thomas for permission to continue seeing Ruth. Thomas received him in the library. The door remained open, perhaps because Thomas wanted the household to hear him reclaim authority. He said the rumors were unfortunate, but temporary. His wife's charitable interests had become entangled with an ungrateful former employee. He would soon restore order. Eleanor stood in the hall. Daniel said he had not come to ask whether order would be restored. He had come to say he intended to call on Ruth, unless Ruth herself refused him. Thomas replied that a gentleman respected a father's house. Daniel said a physician also respected facts. He had been in the fever ward. He knew who had provided the linen, who had organized the wagons, and who had left a comfortable supper to carry gowns up unfinished stairs. Thomas looked past him and saw Eleanor. For 1 second she watched shame approach. Then pride stepped in front of it. He told Daniel the interview was over. Daniel bowed to Eleanor in the hall. He waited there until Ruth came downstairs. They sat in the parlor with the door open, and Beatrice positioned between them like an armed treaty. Thomas returned to the library. At supper, he said the family had become a spectacle. Eleanor asked who had first made her labor into a joke before a public table. He accused her of preserving one careless phrase as if it were a crime. She told him the phrase mattered because it revealed the life beneath it. Thomas said men spoke lightly at dinners. Women of sense understood. Beatrice, who had stayed for supper without invitation, put down her spoon. She said men depended on women of sense to translate contempt into harmlessness. It saved them the inconvenience of changing. Thomas stared at his mother. Beatrice had corrected him all his life, but always on the side of family dignity. This was different. She was no longer teaching him how a Vale should appear. She was asking what kind of man a Vale had become. He left the table before dessert. The bank called Thomas's note 3 days before Christmas. Crescent Steel postponed the Eastern Rolling Mill. The labor dispute had worsened, credit had tightened, and Mr. Bellamy denied that any site had ever been selected. Land prices around the proposed tract fell within hours. The syndicate's partners blamed one another. 2 paid their shares, 1 vanished. Thomas did neither. The bank gave him 30 days. He did not tell Eleanor. The notice arrived at his office, and he carried it in the inner pocket of his coat for a week. She learned only because Mr. Seelig monitored the filing and sent her a copy. Christmas Eve came under heavy snow. The Vale dining room was decorated with evergreen and red ribbon. Ruth had placed oranges at every plate. Peter brought home a small wooden wagon he had carved for Anna Kowalski's brother. Beatrice arrived with no gifts except 2 envelopes for the children and a pound of coffee too expensive for anyone to brew without ceremony. Thomas came late. He smelled of snow and whiskey. Not enough to stagger, but enough to make his eyes shine. Beneath his arm he carried a flat parcel wrapped in silver paper. He gave it to Eleanor before dinner. Inside lay a blue silk evening gown from Kaufmann's. The color was young, the waist cut for a figure Eleanor had not possessed in 10 years, and the price equaled a Riverside worker's wages for a month. Thomas said he wanted peace between them. Everyone in the room understood the gown was not peace. It was an attempt to return Eleanor to the scale he preferred. A wife offended by a joke, soothed by silk.
She thanked him because the children were watching.
During dinner, Thomas spoke too brightly. He described a possible promotion, a new arrangement at the bank, a dinner Mr. Bellamy might host in January. He asked Ruth about Daniel with exaggerated tolerance, and told Peter that a place could be found for him at Crescent after school. Peter said he intended to study engineering. Thomas replied that practical work was the best engineering school. Peter said Riverside would help pay for Carnegie Technical Schools when it opened. The room became silent. Thomas turned to Eleanor. She had discussed the new institution with Peter, but no decision had been made. Thomas heard only that her money had entered his son's future without permission. He asked whether she planned to purchase the children's loyalty. Ruth rose from the table. Peter's face went white.
Eleanor told Thomas he had been drinking and should stop. The words broke whatever restraint remained. He said she had humiliated him before colleagues, taken his secretary, set his mother against him, investigated his private affairs, and now meant to teach his son that his father was unnecessary. Beatrice told him he had made himself unnecessary by refusing to see what others carried. Thomas struck the table with his palm. A wineglass tipped and spread red across the cloth. For an instant, no one moved. Then Eleanor lifted the cloth at the edge so the wine ran away from Ruth's dress. The gesture was automatic, domestic, absurdly calm. She thought of all the spills she had stopped before they stained something precious. Money, reputation, fear, a man's pride. She let the cloth fall. Thomas said the bank required payment. He said it at last, not as confession, but accusation. If Eleanor refused the money, the family home would be sold. Ruth's wedding prospects, Peter's schooling, Beatrice's name, everything would suffer, because Eleanor wished to prove a point. Ruth asked how much. $4,000 plus interest. Peter gave a low whistle before he could stop himself. Beatrice's face did not change. She asked Thomas what security he had pledged. He said the house. Ruth sat down again. Eleanor looked at the evergreen on the mantel, at the oranges, at the blue silk folded on a chair. She had planned to tell the children after Christmas, privately and with care. Thomas had turned the truth into another burden they must carry around him. She said Riverside could pay the note. It would require postponing a second fever boiler, reducing the winter reserve, and risking 61 wages if another emergency came. She would not do it. Thomas called that heartless. Eleanor said the house could be sold. Her share of the proceeds, if any remained, would secure rented rooms for Ruth, Peter, and herself. Thomas could use his share against the debt. He stared as if she had spoken of his death. She had not decided to leave until the sentence came out. Yet, once it existed, it felt less like a threat than a door discovered in a war. Thomas asked whether she wanted a separation. Eleanor said she wanted a home no one could gamble without her knowledge. Snow brushed the windows. Somewhere down the street, church bells began the late service. Beatrice rose. She told Ruth to fetch Eleanor's business coat and Peter to bring the green box from upstairs. Thomas demanded to know what she was doing. Beatrice said they were going to her house for Christmas. Eleanor looked at the table she had set, the meal cooling beneath silver covers, the wine spreading slowly toward Thomas's plate. She went upstairs, packed one valise, and changed into the grey dress. The blue gown remained on the chair. Beatrice's house had 6 bedrooms and no memory of children laughing in them. By midnight, Peter had changed that. He carried logs, found candles, discovered a tin of cocoa in the pantry, and persuaded the cook to warm leftover pie. Ruth brought down old photograph albums. Daniel arrived after hospital duty and stood uncertainly in the hall until Beatrice told him to stop letting snow into the house. No one pretended the evening was joyful, yet relief moved beneath the sorrow. Eleanor slept in the room that had once belonged to Thomas as a boy. His initials were cut into the underside of a windowsill. A shelf held 3 school prizes and a wooden boat with 1 mast. She lay awake, imagining him alone at the dining table. Love did not vanish when respect did. It remained in the body as habit, the expectation of his step, the knowledge that he disliked cold gravy, the instinct to leave a lamp at the stair. Eleanor hated that tenderness could survive where trust had failed. She had wanted anger to cleanly divide the past from the future. Instead, grief mixed everything. At dawn, she went downstairs. Beatrice sat in the kitchen wearing an old wool wrapper. Without her black silk and erect posture, she looked nearer to 70 than 60. Before her lay both copper stencils. She said Thomas had telephoned twice during the night. The first time he demanded his family return. The second time he asked whether Eleanor had taken the Riverside papers. Eleanor felt the old, cold humiliation, deeper now. Even alone beside a ruined Christmas table, Thomas had thought of money. Beatrice pushed a cup of coffee toward her. She said Henry Vale had once lost their home in Wheeling through a speculation and concealed it until men came to inventory the furniture. Beatrice had been carrying Thomas then. She remembered standing beside a cradle not yet used, while 2 strangers valued it at 50 cents. That was why she bought Riverside's note, not only to protect Eleanor's work, but because she recognized the look of a husband promising that one more risk would repair the last. Eleanor asked why she had never warned her. Beatrice looked at the dark coffee. Shame, she said, had taught her secrecy more thoroughly than wisdom. They sat without speaking. The similarity between Thomas and his father did not make Thomas innocent, nor did Beatrice's hidden help make her years of coldness kind. Family pain did not pass down like silver, unchanged and valuable. It passed like a flaw in metal, invisible until pressure found the weak line. Eleanor thought of Peter. The line could stop. After breakfast, she asked him to walk with her. They went through the snow to a small park above the river. Mills smoked below them even on Christmas morning. Steele did not observe holy days when orders were due. Eleanor told Peter his father was not a villain. Thomas was frightened, vain, and accustomed to being protected from consequences. Those faults could injure a family as surely as cruelty. But Peter must not learn contempt in response. Contempt was how one person made another small enough to ignore. Peter kicked snow from the path. He said Thomas had made her small. She said Thomas had tried. It was not the same as succeeding. Peter asked whether they would ever go home. Eleanor said she did not know. He asked whether she still loved his father. The truthful answer was yes. The complete answer was more difficult. She told him love was not permission. It could remain after a door closed. It could also require that the door stay closed until the person outside learned to knock. Peter considered this with the grave seriousness of 15. Then he gave her a small parcel from his coat. Inside was a copper key tag stamped with E.V. He had made it in the stencil room. The tag fitted the key to Riverside's front office. On the reverse, he had stamped a second line, Seen. Eleanor closed her hand around it. For the first time since leaving the house, she cried. She did not cry loudly. Peter stood beside her, pretending to watch the river while snow settled on both their shoulders. When they returned to Beatrice's house,
Eleanor hung the copper tag from her watch chain. It remained there for the rest of winter. Thomas spent New Year's Day at Beatrice's front door. She did not admit him until Eleanor agreed. He entered the parlor thinner than he had been at Christmas. His coat had not been brushed. The visible signs of suffering stirred Eleanor's old instinct to care for him, but she kept her hands folded. Thomas apologized for the dinner. He apologized for drinking, for frightening the children, and for speaking harshly. He did not apologize for the note, the supper, the years of dismissal, or the belief that Riverside's money should repair his wager. Eleanor listened. He said the bank might extend the loan if Beatrice guaranteed it. Beatrice said no.
He asked Eleanor to reconsider. Riverside could lend him the money at interest. He would sign papers. He would even place her name on the house deed. Eleanor asked what he believed Riverside's reserves were for. Thomas said business reserves were meant to answer need. She said 61 families were a need. He looked at her watch chain. The copper tag caught the parlor light. He read EV, but the reverse lay against her dress. He asked whether all this was truly because he joked about washboards. Eleanor felt the last hope of easy understanding leave the room. She told him no. The joke was a window. She had looked through it and seen the whole house. Thomas rose. He paced between the piano and the cold fireplace. He said he had worked 25 years for his position. Men at Crescent respected him. Mr. Bellamy sought his advice.
A husband could not be expected to report every minor decision to a wife, occupied with children and domestic work. Eleanor said he had just read Riverside's accounts. He corrected himself. With business and children. The correction came too late, and still missed the truth. She asked him to name one Riverside forewoman. He could not. One hospital contract. He said Mercy. Mercy was the hospital their daughter served, and the one whose supper had begun the quarrel. Eleanor asked for another. He could not. She asked what work Ruth performed during a fever night. Thomas said nursing. She asked which work. He became angry. Details, he said. She wanted to drown him in details. Eleanor told him that a life was made of details. The people he loved lived there. Thomas stood beside the fireplace for a long time. When he left, he did not ask when she would return. January hardened around the city. The rivers carried slabs of grey ice. Horses fell on steep streets. Coal arrived late, then wet, then at a price that made every boiler load feel extravagant. Riverside's emergency crew worked 3 nights in 1 week when pneumonia filled the charity wards. Eleanor moved through the days with the copper tag at her waist. She rented 2 rooms above Riverside's main office and furnished them with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a table large enough for papers. She did not move there immediately. Beatrice insisted the family remain on the hill until the house matter was settled. Yet the rooms existed. A key turned in Eleanor's own lock. That knowledge altered the shape of every decision. Thomas returned to the Vale house alone. The bank posted notice of sale in February. Furniture belonging to Eleanor and the children had already been removed under Mr. Selig's direction. The blue silk gown remained in its silver paper on the dining room chair until Thomas sent it to Beatrice's house. Eleanor returned it to the store and placed the refund in Ruth's name. Neighbors observed the movements. Church acquaintances sent notes offering prayer and requesting detail in equal measure. Mrs. Peabody called twice. Beatrice received her once and discussed only the weather until the woman abandoned hope. Thomas's position at Crescent weakened. Mr. Bellamy had learned of the land syndicate. Several clerks had used office information, and the board wanted one name to carry the blame. Thomas had not originated the scheme, but he had recruited 2 participants
and drafted a memorandum describing the proposed site before the announcement. Lillian knew because she had typed it. A Crescent lawyer came to Riverside in late January and asked to speak with her. He wore a fur-collared coat and the polite expression of a man accustomed to entering women's workplaces as if they were kitchens. Lillian received him in the front office with Eleanor present. He asked whether Thomas had dictated the memorandum. She said yes. Had he identified the source of the information? No. Had he instructed her to destroy the shorthand notes? No. He had told her the matter was private and removed the notes himself. The lawyer then suggested Lillian's resignation followed a personal disagreement with Thomas. The implication entered the room before the words finished. Lillian's face lost color. Eleanor placed both hands on the desk. She told the lawyer Miss Price had left Crescent after being ordered to apologize for assisting Mercy Hospital during an emergency. Any other claim would be answered publicly and by counsel. The lawyer smiled. He said he meant no disrespect. Eleanor replied that meaning seemed to be a refuge for careless men. She gave him Mr. Selig's card and ended the interview. After he left, Lillian stood at the window. She had faced hotel stewards, drivers, forewomen, and hospital boards without trembling. Now her hands shook. She said the board would use the rumor to weaken her testimony. Eleanor knew she was right. A woman's accuracy could always be recast as revenge if a man's reputation required it. Lillian asked whether she should refuse to testify. Eleanor said no. Silence did not become honorable simply because speaking carried a price. She did not say the advice was also for herself. That evening, Eleanor wrote Thomas a note, warning him that Crescent's lawyer had visited. She sent it by Peter. Thomas arrived at Beatrice's house within an hour. He accused Lillian of betraying office confidence. Eleanor said Lillian had answered lawful questions about company business. He accused Eleanor of arranging the interview to destroy him. Beatrice asked whether Eleanor had also arranged the syndicate, the mortgage, and the memorandum. Thomas turned on his mother. He said she had always preferred Eleanor because Eleanor allowed Beatrice to feel powerful. The cruelty struck more deeply than he knew. Beatrice's face emptied. Eleanor stepped between them. She told Thomas to leave. He did. Beatrice stood beside the parlor table with one hand gripping its edge. For the first time since Eleanor had known her, she looked near collapse. Eleanor guided her to a chair. Beatrice said Thomas was not entirely wrong. Power had been the language she used when tenderness failed her. She had interfered in his courtship, selected their first house, corrected Eleanor's child-rearing, and withheld praise so that gratitude would always travel upward toward her. She had protected Riverside, but she had also enjoyed being the only person who knew the protection existed. Eleanor knelt beside her. Truth had become easier between them, though not gentler. She said love mixed with power was still love, but it made a bitter meal. They could choose another way now. Beatrice looked at her. Then, with visible effort, she asked what Eleanor needed. No order, no hidden paper, no decision already made. A question. Eleanor answered that she needed Beatrice to testify about the property note if the bank disputed Riverside's independence. She needed her to tell Ruth and Peter the whole history of the sewing room, and she needed her never again to protect any member of the family with a secret. Beatrice agreed. The next Thursday, she told the mending room about closing her own business. Her voice faltered only once. The Vale house sold on February 17th. It brought less than Thomas predicted and more than Eleanor feared. After the mortgage, banknote, penalties, and sale expenses, little remained. Mr. Selig secured repayment of the portion Eleanor could prove she had contributed, but the money did not restore the years in which she believed the house partly hers. Thomas took a room at a respectable boarding house near Crescent Steel. He sent Ruth and Peter letters saying they were welcome to live with him once he obtained better quarters.
Neither answered immediately. Eleanor rented a brick house 2 streets above Riverside. It had 4 small bedrooms, a narrow parlor, and a kitchen that received morning sun. The front steps leaned. The wallpaper in the hall showed green ferns on a yellow ground and had peeled near the ceiling. Ruth loved it. Peter said the cellar could hold a workbench. The deed named Eleanor Vale. On moving day, Riverside women arrived before breakfast carrying baskets, rugs, jars of preserves, and opinions. Margaret directed furniture through the door. Lillian hung curtains. Ruth arranged medical books in the parlor. Daniel repaired the loose front step, while Beatrice sat in a straight chair and criticized his nails. At noon, they ate soup from mismatched bowls because the china had not been unpacked. Eleanor placed the 2 copper stencils above the kitchen door. Peter's key tag hung beneath them. The house was not grand. Smoke reached every window. Wagons rattled before dawn. When the night shift changed, women's voices carried up the hill. It was the first house Eleanor had entered without asking what Thomas would think of it. He came 3 days later. He stood on the repaired step holding a parcel of Peter's books and Ruth's winter cloak. Eleanor invited him into the parlor. Thomas looked around carefully. He saw the inexpensive chairs, the plain curtains, the coal grate. Perhaps he expected to feel triumph because she had descended from their former house. Instead, he looked displaced. He said he had found temporary rooms. Eleanor said the children could visit whenever they wished. Thomas asked whether he could. The question surprised both of them. She said he could call on Sunday afternoons if he sent notice. He almost objected to the formality. Then he nodded. Before leaving, he noticed the copper stencils above the kitchen door. Beatrice's worn letters were easy to read in the afternoon sun. Eleanor told him what they meant. Thomas had never known about his mother's sewing room. He said his father had described Beatrice as delicate when they married. Eleanor replied that men often renamed the strength they intended to use. Thomas stood beneath the stencils for several seconds. He did not apologize, but he looked. It was not enough. It was the beginning of something that might become enough, if pride did not close over it. In March, the Crescent board dismissed 2 clerks and demanded Thomas's resignation. He refused. The board scheduled a formal inquiry. Lillian received a summons, as did 3 men involved in the syndicate. Thomas hired counsel he could not afford, and began telling acquaintances that ambitious subordinates had conspired against him. When Peter visited his father's boarding house, Thomas tried to enlist him. He said Lillian had manipulated Eleanor, that Beatrice's age had weakened her judgment, and that the family could still reunite if Eleanor admitted she had overreacted. Peter returned home silent. That night he removed his father's photograph from his bedroom and placed it face down in a drawer. Eleanor made him put it back. She said pain did not give him permission to rewrite Thomas as entirely worthless. His father had taught him to swim, sat beside him through diphtheria, and spent 6 months' savings on the microscope Peter still used. Those things were true. So were the mortgage and the contempt. Maturity required carrying truths that refused to cancel one another. Peter asked whether Thomas carried such truths about her. Eleanor said, not yet. The inquiry opened on March 21st in a private room at Crescent's downtown office. Lillian testified for 2 hours. She identified the memorandum and repeated Thomas's instructions. She also stated that he had never ordered her to destroy records and had never promised her money. When the board's attorney attempted to suggest a personal attachment, she asked him to identify any evidence. He had none. Thomas's attorney argued that several men possessed the information and that Thomas believed the proposed site was common knowledge. It was a weak defense, but not impossible. The inquiry adjourned for lunch. At 1:15,
The furnace at Crescent's Lawrence Works exploded. The sound crossed the river like thunder. Windows shook downtown. A black column rose beyond the roofs, then opened into brown smoke. Within minutes, telephones rang at Mercy, the police stations, livery stables, and Riverside. Eleanor was in the mending room when the call came. Mercy expected dozens of burns. St. Agnes would take less severe injuries. Crescent's own infirmary had been damaged. Riverside's emergency system, built for fever, changed purpose in 10 minutes. Margaret opened the reserve rooms. Lillian abandoned the inquiry and took charge of transport. Peter ran to Schmidt's stable. Beatrice, who had been mending cuffs, moved from table to table, asking who could remain through the night, and writing names in a firm hand. Eleanor telephoned Mercy. Dr. Green needed sheets, towels, gowns, cooling cloths, and every roll of bandage Riverside could prepare. The reserve held enough for one hospital. 3 would need it. Eleanor made the decision. Mercy received the sterile bandages and burn sheets. St. Agnes received ordinary linen and towels. The damaged Crescent infirmary would receive blankets, aprons, and boiled cloth until surgeons could move the worst cases. She sent a messenger to every hotel customer explaining that deliveries would be delayed 24 hours. 2 complained. 1 offered its spare linen. By 2, injured men began arriving in carts, wagons, streetcars, and private carriages. Their clothes were burned. Some walked with faces too calm from shock. Others cried for wives who had not yet heard. The Riverside yard became a supply station. Women tore worn sheets into strips, boiled them, dried them against heated cylinders, and rolled them while still warm. Lillian stood at the gate directing wagons with a blue flag. Beatrice sorted messages. Peter rode beside the first load to Crescent. Eleanor went to the damaged infirmary. Part of the roof had fallen. Snowmelt and hose water covered the floor. Doctors worked on doors laid across barrels. The air smelled of wet ash, burned wool, blood, and the sweet, sickening odor of injured skin. Thomas was there. He had been returning from the inquiry when the explosion occurred. Instead of remaining downtown, he rode with Mr. Bellamy to the works. A falling beam cut his forehead, but the wound was slight. He was carrying injured clerks from a counting room when Eleanor entered. For a moment they looked at one another across the chaos. Then a doctor shouted for cloth. Eleanor opened the first Riverside crate. The copper mark, blue against pale wood, faced Thomas. Riverside, E.V. He saw it. There was no time for revelation. A burned man needed lifting. Eleanor directed 2 orderlies to clear a table, sent a boy to fetch more water, and counted bandage rolls into a surgeon's hands. Thomas carried crates from the wagon. For 3 hours they worked within 10 feet of each other, without speaking. He watched people obey her, not because she was his wife, not because Beatrice Vale had introduced her, not because a man had loaned authority for the afternoon. Doctors asked her what supplies remained. Drivers waited for her routes. 4 women brought her numbers. The chief surgeon changed his plan when she said Mercy could receive 12 more patients, but no more. A city policeman cleared the gate at her request. Thomas saw Lillian arrive with a second wagon and report to Eleanor in 6 exact sentences. He saw Margaret reject a crate because its cloth had not boiled long enough. He saw Beatrice in an old apron, the proud Mrs. Vale, tying labels to bundles. The world had not changed. Only his place in it had. At dusk, another section of roof shifted. Men shouted. Thomas pulled a young messenger away before bricks fell. A fragment struck his shoulder and drove him to the floor. Eleanor reached him first. His collar was black, his forehead bloody, his left arm hanging badly. He tried to stand and could not. She called Daniel, who examined him, and said the shoulder was dislocated, perhaps fractured. Thomas needed mercy.
The nearest stretcher bore the Riverside mark. As orderlies lifted him, Thomas caught Eleanor's wrist. His fingers closed around the copper tag on her watch chain and turned it. He read the word Peter had stamped on the reverse. Seen. His grip loosened. Eleanor rode with him to the hospital.
Thomas's shoulder was fractured but cleanly set. He spent 4 days at Mercy beneath Riverside sheets. From his bed, he heard the company's name repeated without explanation. Nurses asked for Riverside gowns. An orderly complained that the West cart was late. Dr. Green told the matron to telephone Mrs. Vale. Crates passed the open door with blue, copper-stenciled letters. Eleanor visited each afternoon after making rounds among the injured workers' families. Their conversations remained practical. Pain level, physician's report, boarding house rent, clothes recovered from the infirmary. She brought him a clean nightshirt and the spectacles he had left downtown. On the 3rd day, Thomas asked how many men had died. 17. 9 more were not expected to survive. 36 remained hospitalized. He closed his eyes.
The explosion had been caused by a failed relief valve and a supervisor's decision to continue operation after pressure readings became unstable. Thomas did not oversee furnaces. The fault was not his. Yet he had spent years speaking about output, orders, and expansion as if steel emerged from figures rather than men standing beside heat. He asked how Riverside had prepared so quickly. Eleanor explained the reserve system. Fever wards had taught them to maintain cloth, transport, coal, workers, and written routes for sudden need. Lillian's schedules divided hospitals by capacity. Margaret trained the emergency crews. Thomas listened. He asked what Margaret's surname was. O'Shea. How long had she worked there? 10 years. What did Lillian earn? Eleanor told him the position, not the wage. He nodded. Questions were new ground between them, and both distrusted how easily questions could imitate change. Before Eleanor left, Thomas asked whether Riverside would be paid for the explosion work. The old entitlement stirred like pain beneath a bandage. She said Mercy and St. Agnes would pay under emergency contracts. Crescent Steel had no agreement, but Mr. Bellamy had promised the company would settle all charges. Thomas looked embarrassed. He said that was not why he asked. He wanted to understand. Eleanor said understanding began with better questions. On the 4th day, Mr. Bellamy visited. He stayed 15 minutes. Crescent's president expressed gratitude for Thomas's conduct at the infirmary and regret about the inquiry. Given the disaster, the board would postpone its decision. Thomas said the decision should not be postponed. Mr. Bellamy looked surprised. Thomas admitted using proposed expansion information for the land purchase. He said others had done the same, but that did not excuse him. Lillian Price's account was accurate. Mr. Bellamy's manner cooled. He asked whether Thomas understood that such a statement would end his career at Crescent. Thomas looked toward the sheet over his injured arm. The blue mark was faint near the hem. He said yes. After Mr. Bellamy left, Thomas asked the nurse to send for Eleanor. She came at 7, tired from a meeting with the City Relief Committee. He told her what he had done. She felt relief, grief, and suspicion together. Confession could be another form of rescue, if the confessor expected applause. Thomas did not ask forgiveness. He said only that the board would dismiss him and that he would accept it. Eleanor sat beside the bed. He spoke slowly. The hospital had made it impossible not to see, not Riverside alone, but every person whose work he had compressed into a word because detail threatened his importance. He had called 61 people washerwomen, as if the name erased skill. He had called Ruth's work nursing, as if that answered anything. He had called Eleanor's life an occupation, a project, a domestic interest. Each word closed a door.
He said he had not been ignorant. Eleanor waited. Thomas said ignorance suggested missing information. He had refused information. She had placed it before him, and he moved it away from the gravy. She had named numbers, and he corrected them. She had said the business was hers, and he searched for a man behind it. The memory of the contract beside his supper plate had remained in Eleanor for 7 years. Hearing him name it broke something open. Tears filled her eyes, but she did not look away. Thomas said the words she had waited half a marriage to hear. I chose not to know. The sentence did not repair the house or return Christmas. It did not erase Lillian's rumor, Beatrice's pain, or the years in which Eleanor had divided herself into a wife at home and a proprietor by the river. But it was true. Truth, after so much reduction, had weight. Eleanor touched his uninjured hand. She did not promise to return. The Crescent board accepted Thomas's resignation in April. The local papers connected it to the land inquiry, though the explosion occupied larger headlines. One paper praised his courage during the rescue. Another called him a disgraced clerk. Neither version held the whole man. Thomas left the boarding house and rented 2 rooms near the courthouse. He sold his club membership, his gold watch, and the shares not already pledged. With part of the money, he paid the remaining bank deficiency. With the rest, he established a fund for the family of the messenger he had pulled from the falling bricks. He did not tell Eleanor about the fund. Daniel did. On Sundays, Thomas came to the brick house above Riverside. At first, the visits were stiff. He brought newspapers for Peter and oranges for Ruth. He remained in the parlor until invited into the kitchen. He asked before giving advice. Sometimes he failed. Once he criticized the neighborhood, and Eleanor ended the visit early. The next week he apologized without explaining what he had meant. He sought work. Men who had praised his judgment at dinners now failed to answer letters. A machinery firm offered him a clerkship at half his former salary. He accepted. The office stood across the river, and Thomas rode the streetcar before dawn. For the first time in 20 years, he carried his own dinner pail. The humility did not ennoble him immediately. Some mornings it made him bitter. He complained about young supervisors and crowded cars. Eleanor listened, only when complaint did not become contempt. Beatrice watched him with severe hope. She did not forgive easily, because she no longer believed quick forgiveness was a woman's duty. Yet she invited him to supper once a month. She told him the full story of her sewing room. When he tried to blame his father, she stopped him. Henry had taught the pattern. Thomas had chosen to cut from it. In May, Beatrice suffered a mild stroke in the Riverside mending room. One side of her face slackened. The needle fell from her hand. Margaret recognized the danger and sent for Daniel at once. Beatrice survived, but her left hand remained weak. Recovery humiliated her. She could no longer fasten her own cuffs, write a steady note, or hold the cane she had carried as a symbol of authority. For 2 weeks, she refused visitors except Eleanor. Then Margaret arrived at the Hill House with a basket of mending. She told Beatrice the buttonholes at Riverside had become disgraceful, and no one else possessed standards. Beatrice knew manipulation when she heard it. She went back the following Thursday. The women placed cloth in her right hand and asked judgment instead of stitches. Beatrice learned to teach without seizing the work. It was another language she had never practiced. Above the stencil bench, her BH mark remained. Mercy Hospital dedicated its surgical wing in June. The founders' supper committee planned another ceremony. This time, Dr. Green refused a ballroom. The dedication would be held at the hospital in daylight, with nurses, orderlies, suppliers, and patients' families present. The printed program named donors on one page and working partners on another. Riverside Sterilized Linen Company appeared beneath Eleanor Vale, proprietor. Eleanor saw the proof before printing. She corrected 2 commas and returned it without comment. On the morning of the dedication, she wore a dark blue dress Ruth had helped choose. It was not the silk Thomas bought. The sleeves allowed movement. The collar carried no lace. The copper key tag hung from her watch chain. Beatrice attended in a wheeled chair, furious about the chair and secretly pleased by the attention. Peter stood behind her. Ruth wore her nurse's uniform. Daniel remained on duty, but promised to come down if no patient required him.
Lillian organized the ceremony.
She had become Riverside's assistant superintendent in name as well as function. Margaret approved, which mattered more to Lillian than any printed title. Her parents, who had doubted the wisdom of leaving Crescent Steel, sat in the 3rd row. Thomas came alone. He chose a seat near the back. Mr. Bellamy and 2 Crescent directors occupied the front row. Their company had given a large donation after the explosion. A bronze tablet beside the entrance bore the names of the 17 dead men. No company officer's name appeared above theirs. Dr. Green spoke briefly. He described the new operating rooms, the recovery ward, and the lessons of the fever emergency. Then he did something Eleanor had not expected. He brought the broken copper stencil to the platform. Peter had loaned it without telling her. Dr. Green held it so the wired split showed.
He explained that on the day the boiler failed, this plate marked the last crate from the disabled Riverside works. Mrs. Vale opened an abandoned washhouse, gathered workers, restored steam, and supplied a fever ward before night. 5 months later, the same organization supplied 3 hospitals after the Crescent explosion. He said buildings were dedicated in the names of those who gave money, but hospitals survived through people who understood cloth, heat, time, fear, and responsibility. Then he spoke Eleanor's full name. Applause rose. It was not thunderous. No orchestra played. Some people clapped because others did. Yet nurses stood. Riverside women stood. Orderlies stood. Families of injured steelworkers stood, one by one, until the back of the hall filled with people on their feet. Eleanor remained seated beside Beatrice. Her mother-in-law reached for her hand with the weakened left one. The fingers could not close fully. Eleanor turned her own palm upward beneath them. Across the aisle, Thomas stood. He did not look proud, as if her name belonged to him. He looked broken and grateful and late. That was harder to bear. After the ceremony, people crowded the corridor. Hotel managers shook Eleanor's hand. Nurses introduced mothers whose children had survived the fever ward. Mr. Bellamy offered a formal compliment and asked whether Riverside would bid on Crescent's permanent infirmary service. Eleanor said it would bid under the same conditions as any other customer. Mr. Bellamy glanced at Thomas in the distance. He said he expected no favor. Eleanor replied that expectation was wise. Near the stairs, Lillian's father embraced his daughter. He was a quiet bookkeeper who had once warned that no respectable employer would take a girl who resigned in anger. Now he asked to see the root system she had designed. Lillian smiled through tears. Thomas waited until the corridor emptied. He approached Eleanor and Beatrice. His suit was carefully brushed, but shining at the elbows. The difference from the man at the founder's supper was visible, and not merely financial. He returned the program Eleanor had dropped beneath her chair. Her name was printed across the page. Thomas said he had read it. Eleanor almost smiled at the inadequacy. Then she saw that he meant more than the page. He had read the contracts she sent him after the hospital confession. He had visited Riverside with Peter and learned the root room, the boiler rules, Margaret's surname, and the purpose of the brass checks. He had read Beatrice's old wage lists.
He had asked Ruth what happened during a fever night and listened until she finished.
Reading had become his form of penance. Eleanor thanked him for the program. Thomas asked if he might call on Sunday. She said yes. He bent to kiss his mother's cheek. Beatrice allowed it. Then he left the hospital alone. Summer brought no grand reconciliation. Thomas did not return to Eleanor's bed, and Eleanor did not return to being the wife who arranged her day around the sound of his key. He called on Sundays. Sometimes Ruth and Peter joined them. Sometimes Beatrice came down from the hill. Sometimes Thomas and Eleanor sat alone in the narrow parlor while wagons rattled toward Riverside below. They learned conversation again in pieces. Thomas described the machinery office where he now copied orders beneath a supervisor younger than Lillian. Eleanor described a dispute over cloth weight with a hotel in Wheeling. At first, he tried to offer solutions before she finished. She would stop speaking. He learned that silence no longer meant consent. It meant the door had closed. He began asking, "What did you decide?" The question changed everything, because it placed authority where it belonged. Eleanor did not reward each improvement with forgiveness. Growth was not a performance staged for her approval. Thomas had to live differently when no one watched. He did. At the machinery office, a female clerk named Agnes Reed kept the shipping correspondence. When the owner praised Thomas for reorganizing foreign orders, Thomas said the system belonged to Miss Reed. The correction cost him nothing, but the old Thomas would have considered even that small cost unnecessary. Agnes told Lillian, who told Eleanor. Eleanor said Thomas about it. In August, he came to Riverside on a Sunday when the boilers were quiet. Peter showed him the stencil room. The copper plates hung above the bench. BH, worn at the edges. Riverside. EV, wired through the split. And the new working stencil, darkened by months of paint. Thomas asked to hold the broken one. Peter gave it to him. Thomas traced the letters with his thumb. He said William had advised using a man's full name because customers trusted it. Eleanor had never told him that part. Peter had heard it from William. The story now belonged to the family, no longer hidden in a green box. Thomas looked at Eleanor. He said he was glad she had refused. She answered that at the time, she had hoped he would be glad too. He closed his eyes for a moment. Then he said he was sorry she had needed his pride, and received his permission instead. It was a more exact apology than any he had offered before. Eleanor took the stencil from his hands and returned it to the wall. They walked through Riverside together. She showed him the boiler installed with the Mercy contract, the reserve room Lillian had designed, the mending tables where Beatrice now taught twice a week. Thomas asked about wages, then stopped and asked about people. Which women had children? Who hoped to become a forewoman? Who read English well enough for the new safety notices? What happened to workers too old for the steam room? Some questions revealed how much he still did not know. That no longer angered Eleanor in the same way. Ignorance admitted could be taught. It was ignorance defended that had starved them. At the yard gate, Thomas asked whether she believed a marriage could begin again. Eleanor watched a river packet move beyond the roofs. Its whistle carried through the hot air. She said a marriage could not begin again. The first years remained. So did the harm. People could only begin from where they stood, carrying what they had done. Thomas asked where they stood. She told him. On a Sunday in the Riverside yard, no longer enemies, not yet companions, married by law and separated by truth. He accepted the answer. That acceptance moved her more than pleading would have. Ruth married Daniel the following spring. They held the ceremony at First Presbyterian and the breakfast in Beatrice's garden. Mrs. Mercer attended in lavender and behaved with the rigid courtesy of a woman who had lost an argument but intended to preserve the furniture.
She had eventually accepted that no rumor survived Daniel's refusal to fear it. Ruth wore a simple white dress. Riverside's mending room made the veil.
Beatrice, using only her right hand, attached the final stitch. Thomas walked his daughter down the aisle. Before doing so, he asked Ruth whether she wanted him to. The question brought tears to her eyes. After the ceremony, Dr. Green offered Ruth a permanent nursing position in the surgical wing. She accepted. Marriage did not end her work. Daniel expected no such sacrifice, though Beatrice warned them both that expectations could change once comfort entered a house. Peter passed the entrance examination for Carnegie Technical Schools when the institution opened in 1905. Riverside paid his tuition as a formal loan, documented by Lillian and signed by Peter. Eleanor refused to disguise education as a gift he had not earned. Peter spent summers improving boiler guards and devising a safer locking frame for the mangles. His first patent drawing carried EV in the lower corner. He said the initials meant Engineering Verified. Eleanor let him keep the joke because it lifted rather than reduced. Lillian became superintendent in 1906. She did not marry Thomas, as one last stubborn version of the old rumor predicted. She married no one during the years Eleanor knew her. She purchased a small house for her parents and joined a women's business association that met above a bookseller's shop. At meetings, she taught young clerks to keep copies of their work and to place their own names on proposals. Margaret O'Shea retired from the steam room, but refused retirement from Riverside. She occupied a desk near receiving and frightened suppliers into punctuality. Beatrice established a training fund for widows who wished to enter trades. She named it the Hale Sisters Fund, giving her lost surname back to the city. The announcement appeared on the third page of the newspaper beneath an advertisement for corsets. Beatrice clipped it anyway. She kept the clipping in the green box. No secrets, Eleanor reminded her. Beatrice showed it to everyone. In the autumn of 1907, the banks failed again. Orders slowed. Hotels delayed payment. One private clinic closed. Men lined outside savings institutions while newspapers insisted confidence would restore confidence. Riverside's reserves, rebuilt after the fever boiler and the Crescent disaster, began to shrink. This time, Eleanor did not carry the danger alone. Lillian brought schedules. Margaret brought wage needs. Peter calculated fuel savings. Beatrice offered the Hale Fund and accepted Eleanor's refusal. Ruth told them which hospital services could not be reduced. The workers elected 3 women to attend the planning meetings.
Thomas came because Eleanor invited him. He reviewed no figures until asked. He suggested that the machinery office's unused night wagon might be leased cheaply. The idea saved one delivery route. Then he sat quietly while a 22-year-old Polish mender explained why shorter hours would force mothers to spend more on childcare than they lost in wages. Riverside reduced management salaries first, combined hotel routes, sold one carriage, and kept every worker. The winter was hard. No miracle contract arrived. Eleanor pawned the silver coffee service she had received as a wedding gift. Thomas sold the last share left from his Crescent years and contributed the money, not to Eleanor, but to Riverside, in exchange for a small note at ordinary interest. She made Mr. Seelig prepare the document. Thomas signed without complaint. By the following summer, the worst had passed.
Riverside repaid him. When the final interest was counted, Thomas donated it to the workers' mealroom.
He did not place his name on the wall. Eleanor knew because Lillian showed her the receipt. Again, she said nothing. Some changes deserved the privacy in which they became character instead of display. Beatrice died in 1909 at the age of 73. The end came quietly in the Hill House. Ruth was with her. Eleanor arrived before dawn. Thomas came an hour later and sat on the opposite side of the bed. Beatrice could no longer speak, but she recognized them. On the bedside table lay the green box. Inside were the Hale sisters' newspaper clipping, Riverside's satisfied note, the old wage lists, Ruth's wedding photograph, and one final paper. It was not a will. Beatrice's property had already been arranged openly. The paper was a list in her uneven, right-handed writing.
At the top, she had written, "Things I should have said." The list named Thomas, Eleanor, Ruth, Peter, her dead sister, and 6 Riverside women. Beside Eleanor's name were 5 words. "You built what I abandoned." Beside Thomas's, "You learned later than I hoped." Beatrice had spent most of her life believing affection became safer when encoded in money, property, correction, or silence. At the end, she left words. Eleanor read the list aloud because Thomas could not. After the funeral, the family gathered in the Hill house. The portraits of dead Vales still watched from the walls, but the green box sat open on the dining table. No paper returned to hiding. Beatrice left the house to be sold and divided most of the proceeds between the Hale Sisters Fund and her grandchildren. Her black silk dresses went to a theater company. Her cane went to Margaret, who used it primarily to point at mistakes. The BH stencil returned to Riverside. Peter mounted Beatrice's final list behind glass beneath it. Eleanor objected at first. The words seemed too private for a workroom. Margaret disagreed. She said women had seen enough monuments to what people accomplished, and not enough warnings about what they failed to say. The list remained. Thomas and Eleanor never resumed the old marriage. There was no old marriage worth resuming. After Beatrice's death, Thomas moved into the small rear room of Eleanor's brick house. He paid rent. The arrangement scandalized Mrs. Peabody, who could not decide whether it represented reconciliation or continued separation, and therefore could not tell the story properly. For nearly a year, Thomas remained there. He took breakfast with the family when invited. He repaired the loose garden gate. He attended church beside Eleanor, but did not place a proprietary hand at her back. When Riverside telephoned at night, he warmed her coat near the stove and asked no wounded question about when she would return. Trust came back, like circulation to a numbed hand, painful, uncertain, and never exactly as before. One October evening, 5 years after the crate arrived before breakfast, Eleanor came home from Riverside to find Thomas in the kitchen. He had prepared soup badly. The potatoes were uneven and the broth too salty. He stood beside the stove with the anxious dignity of a man offering a thing he could not pretend was effortless. On the table lay a key. It was not the key to her house. That remained hers. Thomas had rented the adjoining brick house, empty since summer. He proposed that they open a door between the 2 gardens, not the houses, the gardens. He said they might live near one another, share meals when they wished, help Ruth with the new baby, and remain married without asking Eleanor to become invisible again. If, after time, she wanted another arrangement, she could say so. He did not call the proposal peace. He called it a beginning from where they stood. Eleanor tasted the soup. It was dreadful. She laughed. The sound startled them both. Thomas laughed too, then stopped because tears had risen in his eyes. Eleanor did not give him an answer that evening. The next spring, Peter cut a gate into the fence between the gardens. No door was ever cut between the houses. Some neighbors considered that failure. Eleanor did not. Thomas and she drank coffee beneath the pear tree on Sunday mornings. They attended Ruth's children together. They quarreled about money, politics, Peter's machines, and whether the garden required more sun. Thomas sometimes slipped into the old habit of explaining her own business to her.
Eleanor would touch the copper tag at her waist, and he would stop. Not always gracefully. But he stopped. Riverside grew to 83 workers before Eleanor retired from daily management. Lillian succeeded her. At the retirement gathering, there was no hotel ballroom and no head table. The mending room was cleared. Children and grandchildren crowded between baskets. Dr. Green, older and stooped, came from Mercy. Ruth wore the dark uniform of a nursing superintendent. Peter arrived with grease on his cuff from the boiler safety firm he had founded. Thomas stood near the back. Lillian brought down the broken copper stencil. Its wire had darkened. Blue paint remained in the corners of the letters.
She spoke of the night the old Washhouse opened, the winter reserves, the hospital contract, the explosion, the panic, and all the ordinary mornings that followed. She named Margaret, Beatrice, Peter, Ruth, the drivers, the boiler women, the menders, and those who had died. Then she named Eleanor. This time Eleanor stood. She thanked them without pretending she had built alone. She told the workers about Beatrice's hidden guarantee and why hidden protection was not enough. She told the younger women to place their names on what they made, to learn the numbers, to ask who held the deed, and to distrust praise that offered admiration without authority. Her speech was short. Work waited even at a retirement gathering. Afterward, Thomas approached with a small parcel wrapped in brown paper. Inside was a frame made from the wooden door of the first Riverside wagon.
Set into it were the 3 pieces of copper. Beatrice's BH stencil, the broken Riverside EV plate, and Peter's key tag. The tag had 2 sides. EV seen. Thomas had arranged the frame so both could be read. Eleanor ran her thumb over the old copper. He said nothing about pride. The word had belonged too often to the person who watched, rather than the person who worked. He only asked where she wanted it hung. Eleanor looked around the mending room. Above the long tables, afternoon light filled the steam-softened windows. Young women bent over cloth. Older women corrected them. Lillian stood near the root board with a pencil behind one ear. Beatrice's list remained beneath glass. Eleanor chose the wall beside it. Peter drove the nail. Thomas held the frame until it was level. Ruth stepped back and said the left side needed to rise a fraction. When they finished, Eleanor touched the copper one last time. The initials had survived steam, paint, fire, ridicule, debt, and silence. They did not prove that she had never been wounded. They proved the wound had not become her name. Outside, a Riverside wagon started down the hill toward Mercy Hospital. Its wheels struck the cobbles in a steady rhythm. On the side, fresh blue letters shone from the new stencil. Eleanor heard the workers return to their tables. She smiled. Then she returned, not to the life others had named for her, but to the life she had named herself.